would teach at the Salesforce Tower. My badge lets me into the building. It lets me onto quite a few floors. I haven't tested it on every single floor, but it lets me onto many floors, especially the floor where my team works or the floor where I regularly teach my classes. Just like your user's profile, that's kind of like their badge. Their profile normally gives them access to a number of objects, but they need access to the org first. So right now in the US, many of our Salesforce offices are hard closed. So even though my badge would normally get me onto floors in that office, if I can't first get into the building, doesn't matter that my badge lets me onto floors, I won't be able to access it. So I need access to the building first. Your users need access to the org first. Now, if I were to gain access to the building, I went up to a floor where I teach. If I walk around that floor, there are a lot of different rooms on the floor. There are some rooms that I have full access to. Maybe it's the room where I'm teaching. We can call that my room for the week at least. And in that room, I could go in, I could move stuff around if I wanted to. I have full access to that room. But there are other rooms that maybe they're the rooms that have the big glass walls. We call those fishbowl rooms. And maybe those rooms, I can see into them, but I can't actually go in and move anything around. The door is shut and it's locked. And there are other rooms still that I have no access to. Maybe I don't even know they exist. Maybe there's a janitorial closet kind of behind a corner somewhere, and there's no windows. The door is shut. It's locked. I have no access to that room. Those are like the different levels of access that your users have to records. Some records that they can see and edit. Some records that they can see but not edit. Other records they have no access to. It's almost like those records don't exist for them. But again, and this is probably where the biggest confusion comes in, again, your users need the object level access first before they can get to the individual record. If they don't have the object access first, doesn't matter if someone shares a record with them, they won't be able to do it. So let's say you and I work in the same building, but maybe there's a really high level of security on your floor. And you've set up a meeting with me. You said, hey, I reserved a room for us on my floor. Come meet me in this room. And you're going to let me into that room. You're going to share that room with me. But if I get up to the floor and my badge doesn't let me on the floor, it doesn't matter that you're going to share that room with me if I can't first get onto the floor. So you always need that object access first. Then I need access to a room before I can get access to a locked cabinet within a room, before I can get access to the field. So just come back to this analogy and remember you always need access to the outer layers first. Let's talk about a few of these terms, and some of them will come up again. When you're talking about the organization itself, so you're building access, there are different ways you can control this access. The first is you can set trusted IP ranges, Now, many of you may have had the experience when you first log into Salesforce org, or you're logging in from a new browser, or you refreshed your browser, you cleared your cache, you cleared your cookies, where you have to go through an extra verification step. It sends you a code, maybe it sends you a text message, or get it via email. That's that verification process. Kind of like the very first time I went to the Salesforce office, I had to go through an extra step. I had to stop by security. They had to verify that I was who I claimed to be, and then they were able to let me in. Now, if you as an admin decide you want to make it easier for your users to log in process, they get to bypass that extra step. Trusted IP ranges. This is a global setting. It applies to all of your users, and it's a permissive setting. It makes it easier for them to log in. Now, this is a setting that's sometimes confused with login IP ranges, which is restrictive. And the way that I remember, which is permissive and which is restrictive, is I think to myself, okay, trusted IP. If I trust my users to do something, I'm going to permit them to do it. Trusted IP is the permissive one. On the other hand, kind of the flip side of things, I can set login IP ranges and login hours, But this is not global. It's done at the profile level. It's done only for certain groups of users. And both of these two settings, both of these are restrictive. They can actually completely prevent login, at least for a period of time, or at least for a specific IP address. Login IP ranges, again, allow you to set an IP range. And if users log in from within that IP range, users of that profile, then they're able to successfully log in. If they are outside of that IP range, they are actually completely prevented from logging in. They don't go through an extra step. They don't get a code sent to them. They are just unable to log in. Similarly, with login hours, you can set login hours. So maybe you have a summer intern, and maybe they should only ever be logging into Salesforce from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. on Monday through Friday. If that's the case, you can set login hours. And again, if they log in within those hours, they're able to log in. Otherwise, they are completely prevented from logging in. So those are two options to restrict access. And again, they are done at the profile level. Looking at our object access, we'll say we're in the building now. Your object access is partially controlled by your license. And by that, I mean the license that I select is going to determine the available profiles. So if I give someone a Chatter free license, they don't actually have access to any objects. So license does partially control object access. But what I want you to really focus on when it comes to object access is to remember OP. And I apologize for my poor handwriting with my mouse, OP. And that stands for Object, Profile, and Permission Set. OP, Object, Profile, and Permission Set. Your object access is primarily controlled by your object settings on the profile and or permission sets. Profile and permission sets. And we see this term CRED here. That stands for create, read, edit, delete. Those are different object permissions that we can give. We'll see those in another slide in a little bit, but your object access controlled by profile and permission set. Then we have our record access, and this is controlled by a number of different factors. How are the org-wide defaults set? Are we using a role hierarchy? What about sharing roles? What about teams and manual sharing? So a number of different factors. And again, we'll get into those in more detail in just a few minutes. Our last level of access, our field access, is again a little bit controlled by the page layout because you can remove a field from the page layout, but that doesn't necessarily take users' access away. Your field access is primarily controlled by what we call field level security. And field level security just controls two things. Can a user see a field? Can they edit the field? Who can see it? Who can edit? That's all field level security controls. Again, we'll see another slide on it, but that's really that innermost layer of access. So come back to that building analogy if that is helpful as you're thinking about the different layers and the different levels of access that you can give. Next, your user record. So again, a user is someone who has access to your org. User is an object, and then there are individual user records. Those are the individual people with access to your org. This user record contains a lot of important information. You need to enter a name. Address is not required, but can be a helpful way to track the address of your different users because it's so easy to report on. There is one thing that's not called out in the bullet here that I want to point out to you because you'll want to know about it for the exam. So I've got a demo org here. A lot of this has been set up for me, and I'm starting in the front end of my tool, but I want to make my way into setup. And from setup, I want to show you some important fields on a user record. So just using my left-hand menu, going to my list of users, I'll just click on one of my users. Come on, Jacob. There we go. Something very important on the user record, and I'll zoom in a tiny bit so y'all can see a bit better here. Very important on the user record is their username. Here's what you want to know about the username. The username is required. It must be in the format of an email address. So this is probably not a real email address here, but it is in the format of an email address. And it must be unique in the whole world of Salesforce. So one more time. Username is required. It must be in the format of an email address, and it must be unique in the whole world of Salesforce. So what that means is if this long username here, if at any point the same username has been used in any Salesforce org anywhere in the world, it cannot be used again here. And you may have had this experience on Trailhead. Usually when Trailhead has you create a user, it will say, okay, enter this person's name. Maybe it's Ada Jones, and then it will say, enter your own initials and enter today's date, or enter your own initials and enter your favorite color. Well, once when I was teaching, a student of mine did that, and he said, well, wait a minute, this username's used already. And I said, someone else out there has your same initials and favorite color, and that username was used at some point. So it has to be unique in the whole world.